Thanks everyone for taking a view on our video feed here at Hudson Institute. I'm David Asher. I'm a senior research fellow, resident at Hudson. I cover a variety of things, including everything from counter-threat finance and terrorism financing, sanctions evasion, to nuclear, biological, chemical weapons proliferation, an area I've worked on very extensively in the government. And I just want to introduce today Dr. Robert Kadlec, a colleague who has done pioneering work in this area for the U.S. government, going back to his time starting at the U.S. Air Force Academy and then moving into the military for a few decades, and then working in very high-ranking roles at Health and Human Services, conceiving and developing our national biodefense strategy, and then having to try to execute it in the midst of the biggest biothreat disaster, actually, I have to say, in history, which was the outbreak of COVID-19. So I'm here to discuss that with Dr. Kadlec, and also to go over some of the lessons learned over his long and illustrious career. So let's go on and move forward from here. The most important thing I would like to highlight today is the importance of this report called Muddy Waters, which is about the origins of COVID-19. And it's a report that came out from the Senate Health Committee. Dr. Kadlec introduced that. We'll overview that report. But that report is one of the most important reports about COVID-19 to have been issued, if not the most important, in its origins and the relationship of COVID-19 to the Chinese government. So on that note, I'd like to introduce Dr. Kadlec. Bob, I don't know if you want to give any background on how you came to get involved in health and human services, and then how you made your way up to Capitol Hill, but we'd be interested in that.
Well, thank you, David, and certainly it's a pleasure to appear with you today, and certainly for your colleagues at Hudson Institute in the viewership. Just want to say thank you for this opportunity, number one. Number two, how did I get here? Well, the simplest thing to say is I would say I'm a three-peat offender, having worked on Capitol Hill for Senator Richard Burr, first when he was a junior senator from North Carolina when he was first selected in 05-06, then when he became the chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, where I was the deputy staff director from 2015 to 2017, and then with the election of Donald Trump, was asked by then Representative Tom Price to become his Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, which is kind of an interesting turn of events, because when I first worked for Richard Burr in 05-06, we actually wrote the enabling authorization legislation that created the ASPR, the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, and BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research Development Authority, which was central to the genesis of Warp Speed during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Well, I mean, I should have credited your work on the Hill as well, but you've done so many different things. But those were very important efforts. Of course, the immediate question that we can talk about later is really what happened, because we had the exact appropriate architecture that you'd helped develop for the government, and I don't think it failed us. I think it did contribute significantly. People just totally underrate how the work that you had done with a small group of colleagues created Operation Warp Speed, and created the ability of us to manufacture and develop and manufacture mRNA vaccines. But before we go to that, I think it would be great to get your overview personally of the report you did called Muddy Waters about the origins of COVID-19. It is, like I said, the most detailed and most, frankly, most enlightening report that I've read at the unclassified level. Obviously you were doing this for Senator Burr and the other Republican members of the Health Committee. But if you could explain a little bit about how you got into it, what motivated you, and sort of initially, and what you learned along the way.
Sure. Well, first of all, it was a task that was assigned to me on 7 June 2021, my second day back on the Hill working for Senator Burr. His intent with, frankly, Chairman Patty Murray, who was the the chairwoman for the HELP committee, was to create a bipartisan investigation using only open source information to determine, if possible, the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. That task really was focusing for 20 months during my tenure on the Hill to look at two different hypotheses. One, whether or not the virus emerged from a zoonotic event, which was from an animal, possibly a bat, or some intermediate species such as pangolin or palm civet, or was this a consequence of some kind of laboratory research that was being conducted in Wuhan, possibly at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The approach we took was very simplistic, really based on what the intelligence community uses as an approach, kind of looking at an evaluation of plausible sub-hypotheses. Is it conceivable that under each of those two larger headings, could there be reasonable or possible events that could result in a pandemic? And conveniently, we found 3 sub-hypotheses for each of those categories. And then we conducted our investigation as a team of teams, which is we created a team A and team B, led by 2 lawyers who conveniently worked for me both at HHS and now at the Senate Help Committee Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee. And they led the effort to accrue evidence from open source materials, validating the material or information as we could, that would align to either a zoonotic origin or a lab research origin. And that's how we proceeded. And we were backed up by a fairly extensive outside technical team, people that we solicited for their insights, many of them who offered their time freely, willingly, and free to provide us technical insights as it relates to biosafety, molecular biology, epidemiology, medical infectious diseases. So we had another dozen people outside the 6 or 7 that we had, dedicated to the effort.
Yes, I met several of your team members early on, and I was very impressed by them as an exceptionally high quality group of people they have on Capitol Hill to take time to undertake an effort that was really unpopular. Let's face it, at the time, no one really was, people may have been interested in knowing the origin, but the government, the executive branch, was not particularly interested in sharing information related to that. And so to do something at the unclassified level, particularly, was extremely difficult, and to do it in a way that was truly not biased, where you had one team that was sort of pro or lab leak, the other team that was essentially focused on natural origin, and trying to gather evidence for each hypothesis was especially grueling, I think. And difficult to undertake, but you certainly did a great job. As I've read this report, which is about 300 pages, about 200 pages of text, and then of written text, and then about 100 pages of footnotes. And those footnotes are very important. What could you say about some of the things that you learned regarding the origin that really changed or shaped your view in the course of doing the report, putting aside what you learned in the context of the government and from other sources that aren't available? I noticed that you did dwell on the quite sharp increase in influenza-like illness in China in the fall of 2019, for example. If you could sort of give us a few minutes of detail on that, it'd be great.
Sure. Well, one of the things that what we did differently from the intelligence community, and we were beneficiaries of the unclassified report by the Office of Director of National Intelligence, and we did at some point in time get access to the classified report. But I think the key thing is that we opened the aperture of our investigation that proceeded well beyond the time frame that the DNI did. So, for example, we looked well beyond the fall of 2019 and going back actually to the fall of 2018 and even earlier to evaluate what would say the trajectory of coronavirus research in China, particularly at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. just recognize that the WIV, as the Wuhan Institute of Virology is known as, is not the only institution in Wuhan that does this kind of research. There are a number of colleges, universities, veterinary schools that participate. And so it was really to understand what was the kind of baseline, if you will. What we learned through this kind of temporal evaluation that began literally in 2017 when the construction of the Wuhan Institute of Virology's Biosafety 4 laboratory was completed, was that there were challenges that they were confronting from the very beginning in terms of accessing materials, expertise, and particularly operationalizing what is a high containment laboratory, a BSL-4, the highest level that you can have, that China had very little experience in dealing with or managing or operating. So as you go forward, you realize that in November 18th, and this was something that the State Department recognized as well, that they reported on the fact that there were a lot of concerns from the Chinese as well as from outside experts, including US scientists who visited, that indicated that there could be a risk to what China was doing as it related to some of this cutting edge technology or cutting edge research with coronaviruses, and the possibility of not having the highest levels of biosafety as a consequence of not only constructing a new facility, but actually operating and maintaining this facility. So coming to your point about what happened, when did it happen, we found some early indicators that there were concerns around biosafety going into the spring of 2019 at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And as that time progressed, we also recognized that there seemed to be even greater concerns as it related to the nature of some of the research that was being performed there, particularly some of the research that seemed to be performed at a lower level of biosafety than typically encountered in other laboratories around the world, particularly the United States. An example, just to give you a little flavor of what we found, and this leads to what happened we believe, to the fall of 2019. Every spring and summer, the Wuhan Institute of Virology would go on field expeditions to southern China where SARS coronaviruses were found. This is found in nature, and they would go into caves, capturing bats, recovering samples from bats, and then taking the samples and sometimes the bats themselves back to Wuhan and to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where they would process the samples, oftentimes at a Biosafety 2 laboratory level, which is like your dentist's offices when you go get your teeth cleaned or whatever. And so we recognized that some of the risk was when they would retrieve these bats and process these samples, oftentimes in lower than acceptable biosafety levels, that could be a risk. The second part of it is that actually they would actually do some genetic manipulation of these viruses, oftentimes in biosafety 2 levels as well. This is documented both in published literature, dissertations that were released from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and actually Shengli Shi, the bat lady's own admissions. So when we get to the fall of 2019, we see that there is this research is ongoing, and there's this explosion of cases of influenza-like illness that begin probably in late October, early November. How do we know this? Well, probably the most compelling observations are made by US diplomats in the Wuhan consulate, who report both to their colleagues at Beijing, and it filters back to the US, that there seems to be a vicious flu outbreak occurring in late October, early November of 2019. This information is further corroborated by the fact that there are some studies that were produced by Harvard that identified there was increased hospital traffic. There was increased searches on their search engine like Google, called Baidu, for symptoms that comport with what COVID-19 was at that time, as well as other reports from our State Department that indicated possibly WIV researchers became sick with COVID-like symptoms in early November, and the South China Morning Post releasing a China CDC report that the first case or documented case of COVID may have happened as early as 17 November. All these things coalesce to a report that was done by Chinese epidemiologists that was published later in 2020 that showed this very large spike of influenza-like illness. And China itself released information to the WHO in April of 2021 that indicated there was a surge in influenza-like cases in early November that were not associated with testing for influenza. So you have this whole mass of events that would say, hey, it's possible, more probable, that cases that were occurring of influenza-like illness that occurred in early November were likely associated with COVID's first emergence.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I observed as the lead investigator in the origin of COVID-19 for the Secretary of State at the State Department, and ultimately reporting up to the National Security Council as well. We saw that spike. It was captured in Chinese statistics, okay? And then we saw a lot of anomalous data that is totally unclassified coming off social media in China, particularly in late November into early December of 2019, that was contiguous or ran in parallel to the increases in ILI, in influenza-like illness, that were not testing positive for influenza. And so I'm a detective, and so are you, Dr. Bob, and your team. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. We've never seen something, and I will always be a little bit cautious as to there's certain things we don't know, but we know a lot if you put together the mosaic, and you'll see there's not that many pictures, the pieces missing from the picture, I should say. The picture is pretty incriminating. And then could you comment on what evidence did you find that there was a natural origin, if any? Did you see indications coming out of China from the Chinese themselves that they had discovered something? Did you see them acting in a way that wasn't panicky regarding the origin, or what was panicky? Is there something about the behavior of the Chinese government that you observe from metadata, let's say, or from just reading the press, that convinced any of your team that they didn't know where this thing came from?
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because probably the benefit of doing the investigation that we did, where we had a team A and team B, was trying to accrue all the evidence that we could from all sources that were published or otherwise that would provide at least some reason to believe that this could have been a zoonotic event, meaning coming from an animal. And what we found quite strikingly is that even though precedence favors that, if you will, answer, there was no documented information or evidence that would support that. So, for example, when SARS originally occurred in 2002 and 2003 in China, and by the way, was also subject to a cover-up by the Chinese government, what we were able to ascertain was they were able to identify fairly rapidly an intermediate host, this case a palm civet that was being sold in wet markets. This was a food source, and so the animals would be slaughtered by the animal handlers. And interesting enough, typically animal handlers were some of the first people to get sick with SARS in 2003 and 2004. So fast forward to 2019, 2020, we don't see any evidence, and China has not been able to produce an intermediate host for this that may include, and there was a lot of recent to do about a raccoon dog and a palm civet, but none of those animals were found to be infected with SARS-CoV-2, nor were any animal handlers found to become infected with that. Interesting enough, there was a study published in the spring of 2020 that indicated that they were doing longitudinal surveys of the 7 wet markets in Wuhan 3 years prior to the pandemic. And interesting enough, they weren't looking for SARS-CoV-2, but 2 things were notable from that study. First of all, that animals that were susceptible for SARS-CoV-2, like the raccoon dog, palm civets, were sold there. But interesting enough, no bats were sold there. And why is that important? Because the bats were a very important source of the virus in southern China, where the bats and the susceptible animals were brought to the wet markets together where they were sold as food. So, interesting enough, bats are not a food source in Wuhan. Interesting enough, it's a local delicacy, not one in Wuhan. And quite frankly, it's kind of an anomaly to see it, nor were pangolins sold in the wet markets. So we could say that at least from the standpoint of historic precedents, historic evidentiary data, that key connections that would normally be found in historic cases of SARS transmission documented previously were absent in Wuhan at that time. What was really kind of interesting is that we showed evidence, particularly in this early November timeframe, of what would have been concerted government activities that would suggest something did happen, likely at the Wuhan Institute of Virology and possibly at the Wuhan University Institute of Animal Models. Why do we think that? Well, we found some reports that would indicate that at that same time, there were publications, probably deceptive in nature, that were trying to cover the tracks, if you will, of the involvement of the Wuhan Institute of Virology BSL-4 laboratory and the Wuhan University. The second thing is we had a high-level Chinese official come from China's Academy of Sciences on the 19th of November, where he did a couple of interesting things. His day of arrival was notable because it was subject of an internal posting on the Wuhan Institute of Virology website that indicated that he met with senior leadership and read what was likely a P-Sure, which is a Chinese mechanism of reporting that often goes through political channels to the highest level that is needed to resolve an issue or a problem, and then that individual sends back down instructions. It appears that this chap from Beijing was carrying orders from Xi Jinping himself that indicated there were concerns around biosecurity around the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and in fact, that he was lecturing them about issues that were a matter of national concern. So we do know on the 19th of November, a senior official from the Chinese Academy of Sciences, their lead biosecurity official, came down to the Wuhan Institute of Virology and met with senior leadership and brought with him a P-Sure, which is by description orders from a high-level senior official. In this case, the official from Beijing brought down instructions directly from Xi Jinping related to the issues around biosecurity at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The very next day, he also led a 2.5-day remedial biosafety training program for members at the WIV as well as at the Wuhan University, as well as some other institutes in Wuhan, indicating something may have happened. Coincidentally, at the same day that he arrived on the 19th of November, the Wuhan Institute of Virology issued a short notice procurement for a device that would be added to an autoclave exhaust pipe called an air incinerator, which is quite an unusual activity, but would suggest possibly there was some kind of possibly infectious release from an autoclave. Autoclaves are used to sterilize infectious waste from biosafety laboratories, and oftentimes by the use of steam, pressure, and temperature over time, that renders whatever infectious material is inert or uncontaminated. But for some reason, on the very day this gentleman came from Beijing, they actually had to order a special device that would augment the sterilization capacity of this autoclave. So there is circumstantial evidence, at least in my mind, that there may have been some kind of event that preceded his arrival that required the response of a high-level official, awareness by the senior government, as well as remediation efforts that were taken at the WIV.
Yeah, I mean, and I want to add something that's not been noted in publications or in the media up to now. That we noticed that Hudson in our research recently, Dr. Ji Zheng, that official who is quite important, was sent by the Communist Party leadership to from Beijing to Wuhan, is now the head of biosafety at the Wuhan Institute of Virology in the Chinese. It's only on the Chinese website of the Wuhan Institute. It's not in English, but it's somewhat telling that the guy who was dispatched to apparently read the Riot Act to Wuhan Institute has been put in charge of biosafety itself. This is more than an anomaly. Like I said, someone who's been a detective and worked on major crime investigations in my career, as well as other types of work against proliferation networks and criminal networks. But this is something that I find almost unbelievable, in that the guy who is really the top person in the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Beijing is now at Wuhan. I can't imagine that he's there for no reason. I don't know, but Dr. Bob, if you have any thoughts on that.
No, that was a bit of a revelation when you sent that to me, and I have to admit that's an important additional finding. And again, if you consider, as we've looked longitudinally, and again, this was a little different than our colleagues in the intelligence community, that we were able to document things that occurred a year after the date, or what we believe was the time frame when we think something happened, that you would still find evidence of remediation activities. For example, the Wuhan Institute of Virology issued a patent to reformulate its disinfectant that it found to be extraordinarily corrosive to sensitive biosafety equipment at the WIV, that, at least according to the description in the patent, may have resulted or contributed to the escape of highly pathogenic microorganisms from the WIV, though it wasn't specific as to the time frame, but it was specific to the idea that these events could have significant impact on the loss of lives, the effect of social order, as well as the risk to the globe.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you, as someone who has a long and distinguished background in biology, virology. You're not just a government servant. You are a practitioner and someone who's worked in the field for the U.S. military, chasing these pathogens, and also doing training to prepare for them. And we definitely want to turn to that in a minute. When you look at the sequence, one of the things, did you see irregularities the way that some of the colleagues I had less at the State Department itself, although our medical director certainly felt there was something very strange about the furin cleavage site, and saw that like within literally 2 weeks once we had the sequence and they looked at it. What I heard from some of the national laboratories was that they felt there was signature elements that indicated bioengineering. And a lot of it goes back to the phylogenetic information related to COVID, and as Dr. Redfield explained, it seemed pre-adapted to spread for human transmission. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, well, it is a significant finding, and quite frankly, in our study of this is the first, I would say, the first SARS-like coronavirus. And again, there are very different subgenuses of this virus, but the ones that belong to SARS, particularly SARS-1 and SARS-2, that do not have a furin cleavage site. And again, the furin cleavage site is the secret sauce that really gives this virus unusual qualities to not only grow extensively in human lung tissue, but also kind of facilitates its spread, its transmissibility. So to Dr. Redfield's comment, yes, this is a highly transmissible, human transmissible virus that is at odds with what we've historically known or seen in SARS-related viruses previously. The existence of a furin cleavage site, as to be described by a group of researchers at Mount Sinai who are in the midst of publishing their results, feel that the existence of the furin cleavage site is a remote probability event. It's not impossible, but certainly very, very remote in likelihood as it relates to this kind of virus. It is one thing that Dr. David Baltimore, a Nobel laureate, said that at least to him was constituted the possibility of being the smoking gun. What makes it even more kind of compelling, honestly, is what we were able to discern in our investigation that had to do with a proposal that was submitted by EcoHealth Alliance, fronting for a number of US and Chinese investigators that in March of 2018 wanted to do further collection of SARS-like viruses in the wild, but specifically mentioned and intended to insert human furin cleavage sites to evaluate their impact on the potential pandemic value or possibility of a SARS-related virus. So you have this kind of odd set of circumstances when you talk about the remote probability of this occurring in nature. You have an intent a year prior of the desire, even though it wasn't funded by DARPA, it has been suggested by some that the fact that it was conceived as a possible experiment was more likely than not something that was either ongoing or completed at the time that proposal was submitted to DARPA, for example. And then the third element is that there are other factors in the virus that just seem to optimize its ability to infect humans in a way that, quite frankly, is kind of unusual. Regardless, as you've seen, this virus almost has a mind of its own. I don't want to say it's artificially intelligent, but it certainly has been able to circumvent vaccines that we developed initially and has repeatedly developed variants over time that seem to kind of challenge us and make this a persistent threat in many cases where usually pandemics kind of die out and go away. This one kind of gives us the gift that keeps on giving.
Yeah, I mean, I know you know Dr. Ralph Barrick from University of North Carolina. I've spoken with him as well. I don't think anyone doubts his brilliance, but especially given his brilliance, I think it's important to reflect on the fact that he was in the Project Diffuse proposal to DARPA that you outlined. He was going to invest the furin cleavage site artificially using synthetic biology into the coronavirus backbone. And if that could occur naturally, I don't really see a reason, especially given the knowledge of coronaviruses that Dr. Barrick has, which is almost off the charts, that you would, if it could be done through serial passaging, let's say, even through just passing of blood from let's say a monkey, excuse me, a bat to a monkey, and then back and forth. If that could happen naturally, then why would you have to artificially insert it? It doesn't make any sense. I mean, I would say that if they thought that could happen naturally, they wouldn't be in the business of trying to synthetically engineer it. That's just my read. I don't know what you think of that, because I do want to get at the issue of synthetic biology as part of this, because I think that people are underestimating, and this gets to your work, now National Biodefense Strategy, which preceded COVID-19 and did suggest the potential for a lab leak as an origin of a biodefense threat that could terrorize and affect our country. Could you just sort of talk a little bit about synthetic biology and the upsides and the downsides, sure, including what they're doing in Wuhan? Sorry for a long question now.
Sure. Well, first of all, the idea of synthetic biology has been something that has been a matter of fascination going back into the 1950s when DNA was first discovered by Watson and Crick, and the possibility of manipulating the genetic code to get some kind of favorable events. And so, in today's world, synthetic biology offers some really interesting, promising opportunities to provide new food sources, better medicines, remediate the environment, provide new sources of energy. These are all pluses that, quite frankly, gain of function like research could result in. However, when you talk about pathogenic organisms like potentially coronaviruses or influenza viruses, it certainly offers the opportunity to do as we think could have happened. And again, people say it happens naturally. It does, but do so in a way that quite frankly would want to anticipate nature, but is also doing things that nature has not yet demonstrated itself. And so that's the divergence, I think, of what you can do with science and what you should do with science. And I think the challenge that we think may have been confronted or at least kind of encountered by the Chinese is that they were doing research in some ways collaborating with the United States, in some ways getting funded by the United States through NIH grants, where they were trying to do cutting edge research where their means to protect themselves and protect maybe others and the world may have been jeopardized either by their interest to do this science or their zeal to show progress in the science or to demonstrate their superiority in this science that could have resulted in this kind of outcome. So, from the standpoint of synthetic biology, you'd like to say it's generally good until it goes bad. And with that, I think it is the necessity for policymakers here in the United States to realize that there are a lot of good things we can derive from it, but we really need to be especially sensitive and concerned about where bad things could occur. And that could be based on the fact of pursuing gain of function like experiments that, quite frankly, are novel and maybe neat for scientific publication. But quite frankly, the need to know of these things could be representing a proliferation risk. To your earlier comments about the proliferation of this technology, is that, quite frankly, as it emerges as something that pretty much anybody can do, if you can't put safeguards around what should be done, either by preventing funding of this kind of research or ensuring the safety of this kind of research or evaluating who's doing it, the end users, whether their intents are good, bad, or otherwise malicious, then I think we're setting ourselves up for another repeat of this kind of event.
Yeah, I mean, I agree as someone who oversaw the investigative efforts and also worked very closely with the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and our Secretary of State, Michael Pompeo, and his staff to try to get information regarding origins that have been collected in the fall of 2019, but never disseminated. As something that reminded you and I both went through 9/11. I think you were at the Vice President's office, not in that period. I was working for Secretary Powell, but it was when I saw the initial information that hadn't even been pushed out from certain intelligence community partners about workers falling sick in the lab, the military funding research that looked to be was classified research. We put that out in the declassified fact sheet that had been going on since at least 2017 into advanced coronaviruses. It appeared creating new types of coronavirus variants that could be lethal or highly pathogenic. And that was part of a systematic employment of what we believe to be synthetic biology, in large part, but not exclusively, and also experiments on animals that would be in the primate category. As well as the animals that were very odd, like pangolins, by the way. Yes. May have not existed in the market, but according to our declassified intelligence, they highly likely existed inside the Wuhan Institute of Virology's laboratories, and most likely the Wuhan University, which has a huge animal husbandry program. But when we saw all that, and it caused us to say, "Oh my God, this really may have come out of a lab leak." But that bothered us, the lack of transparency in China. But the cover up of everything associated with what happened in Wuhan starting in the fall of 2019, and something you exposed in the report with your colleagues, they started to marshal their resources for PPE, for pandemic preventive equipment. I mean, they stopped exporting stuff in the late fall to the United States and elsewhere. They started to buy PPE up on the global market. I mean, in this case, we really have to ask ourselves, is the cover-up worse than the crime? And our lack of intelligence that was at least immediate and ready on that was probably one of the biggest failures, if not the single biggest failure in the history of intelligence, going well beyond biomedical. I just wanted to ask you, as a guy who's worked like me in the intelligence world, who cares deeply about the work we do and wants to be right, what happened?
Well, it's a great question, and quite frankly, we both lived through the Iraq intelligence debacle, and obviously that had a searing impact on our U.S. intelligence community, particularly on these topical areas. But what really gets my dander up, particularly about this, your question, is that we know that U.S. diplomats in Wuhan knew something was happening in late October, November. That was transmitted to Beijing. There were 2 U.S. health attachés in Beijing at the time. And we spoke to the junior person whose responsibilities included being the coordinator for pandemic preparedness, who was totally unaware of anything occurring in Wuhan or in China as of late December. That, to me, is one of the things that I find most outrageous, that in some ways the intelligence community, for all its benefits and all its limitations, can't do everything. But here is a group of individuals who were assigned to the CDC, whose responsibility was for kind of working with their Chinese colleagues, being the eyes and ears for the U.S. government, not knowing anything was going on, and that the first word that Dr. Redfield got was not from one of his own people in Beijing, but from the director of the Chinese CDC on 4 January. That, to me, is something that, quite frankly, I personally have a lot of intense emotion about, because my job was to prepare and respond to these events, and I found out on the 6th of January, 2 days later. So you're telling me we lost 60 days of indications and warnings about an event that we could have at least have been aware of? The reason why this is important, and I'll just use an example from my own personal experience, is that in September 2020, I traveled with Secretary Azar to Taiwan. And one of the individuals we met with was the vice president at that time, who was a medical epidemiologist, who shared with me the fact that Taiwan understood something was going on in Wuhan in November. There was a mysterious pneumonia going on. And in the case of Taiwan, because of the SARS experience they had in 2003 and 4, they instituted in early December travel screening, travel restrictions, and masking. And oh, by the way, their first cases of COVID-19 did not occur until April 2022, 2 years and 3 months after it emerged in Wuhan. So my question to you is, does early warning and intelligence matter? Yes, it does. We supposed to be, the watchword is whole of government. We had people there whose job it was to keep an eye out on the risks of pandemics emerging from China. And I don't know if they were asleep at the switch or what, but clearly that's something that has to be run down.
Well, I mean, this brings me to the National Biodefense Strategy of 2018, which I believe, were deeply involved in. And I just wanted to note for the record that you looked at 2 potential origins of a possible pandemic. One was natural, the other one was we'll call supernatural. It was a lab leak. It's in the report signed by the President of the United States, Donald Trump. What happened to that document in terms of implementation? I mean, I don't want to be in any way critical, because what you did with Operation Warp Speed, which we'll get to in a second, was absolutely unbelievable. In partnership with some incredible people in Department of Defense and your Deputy Chief of Staff at HHS. But we had, thanks to your work, a biodefense strategy that, if implemented, including intelligence and early warning that was supposed to be there. Why did it? We know some of the intelligence was downgraded. It wasn't by you, obviously. Do you have any idea what happened from your perspective, or is this just the chaos of dealing with an actual pandemic and that you can practice all day and you're never ready for the real thing like we learned on 9/11?
Well, it's interesting because two things. First of all, I just want to laud the effort that was done with that national biodefense strategy, which really represented a consolidation of a number of presidential directives and strategies that were first drafted by George W. Bush. I happened to be the scribe for HSPD 10, NSPD 33, which was the precursor to that strategy, as well as several that were done later by the Bush administration and the Obama administration. So what you were holding up was what I'd say the pinnacle of what our thinking was. But like every great thought, if there's not effort and action to make it real, meaning implemented, that's where the challenge is. Now that started in 2018. The effort was to really review across the U.S. government what was being done. That was done. And then it was the issue, and this gets to the partisan nature of what I think challenges us, and quite frankly, I can point to warp speed as an example of it, is that it used to be said that foreign policy ends at our domestic shores, that we were unified in our view of the threat, particularly during the Cold War. Well, unfortunately, that document and the purpose of behind it was not necessarily had the bipartisan buy-in from our Democratic colleagues that I think really did inhibit our ability to prepare for that. I made several forays to the Hill, trying to basically talk about the strategy and talk about the resources that were needed to do the strategy. And quite frankly, that was a challenge, to say the least. And then you see that kind of as a result of warp speed, when highly successful as that was, it was like warp speed didn't exist when the new administration came in. They took it apart, basically. They put it in the closet, and then here most recently now have said, well, maybe we need it again, and they're calling it next gen. I don't care if you call it a ham sandwich. The fact that they eliminated or stopped the program when they did literally cost American lives. And so yeah, it's a very troubling set of like you said, that strategy, their intent putting a new strategy out, which is their own. That I guess that's the right of every president to redo that. But I think that the document that you held up was a very good document that reflected the efforts of two previous administrations, Bush and Obama, to draft that. And for some reason, it's not good enough now, and we have to get rid of it and do away with it. And so the problem is that the politicization of this issue has been argued to belong to one side and not the other. But quite frankly, it's evident that partisanship has really undermined our ability to manage this pandemic. And if we can't get our act together, it will affect future efforts against this threat, particularly when it could have been an accidental event, which is, again, something that this administration seems to be hard to kind of get their attention to embrace.
I mean, I do find it sort of incredible because objectively, it's well known to pretty much everybody who has any background, and few of us have the level of background you do in biology, and in the government's preparedness for biological events, be they natural or, as I said, supernatural, like for a lab accident. There's just, it's obvious that if you can reverse engineer COVID-19 based on a sequence that was posted in second week of January or something like that, January 9th, January 9th or so. I mean, we didn't have access to COVID-19. We had access to a sequence. We printed that sequence in DNA and managed to recreate it, so we could experiment to create a vaccine against it, which, again, your efforts as ASPR were sort of monumentally significant in attaining. But obviously, if you can reverse it in synthetic biology, you can create it in synthetic biology. So COVID 2025 or COVID 2030 is just around the corner. And you and I both worked on the issue of potential bioterrorism. I mean, now the ability to print genetic material is is not something that even high school AP students are learning how to do. I don't know if you've got thoughts on that issue. As we look ahead, we've got a few minutes left.
Sure.
I just think that
Yeah.
you literally know more about this as a threat. One last point, also to just reflect on NIAID's funding for biodefense. $38.5 billion since 2002. We will be issuing a report from Hudson in the coming weeks about this. Very little, first, initially great impact, but over the years, it seems to have just become its own self-licking ice cream cone under Dr. Fauci. And it's really a question as to like, what biodefense do they actually do, except create bio threats, which if they got out could be hugely detrimental. How do you fix that?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think you've touched on a number of issues. One I would like to first say is, there needs to be accounting of what worked and what didn't work. And I think you've highlighted a couple of them early on with early warning, missed opportunities, and early warning linked with the failures to be able to institute, timely interventions. President Trump was very quick to invoke when he did the travel restrictions. But had that been done 60 days earlier, that could have been all the difference in the world. Witness Taiwan. We certainly had the successes of warp speed, but I think the thing is that we do need to understand that in the era of synthetic biology, that who we give grants to and for what we give grants to do deserve greater scrutiny. I think that is something that, quite frankly, in our investigation, we identified that the oversight of those kinds of grants and that oversight of those kinds of research and not validating the end user, if you will, who was using it, who was doing it, and how they were doing it in terms of their biosafety competence. I think there was plenty of opportunity to probably say no to some of these grants that probably contributed. The proliferation problem. Money is fungible, data is fungible, techniques are fungible. That in this kind of biosynthetic world, we need to do better. The other thing is that we kind of need to clean up our house at home. There's a book that was just published by Allison Young that's called Pandora's Problem or Paradox. It really does highlight, I think, the nature that we're subsidizing research in our own country today that is risky, and we just need to acknowledge it. It some of it has to be done, but clearly the due diligence around who was doing it and how it was being done. One that occurred on my watch, I didn't realize that there were biosafety problems historically with the institution that was involved, but yet that was a grant given by NIH, who knew that deficiency. And then when there was an incident, NIH found out about it and didn't tell anybody about it. Yeah. And so there's this issue of transparency. So there's a lot that we can do across the spectrum. We got to clean up our own whole house, if you will, initially. We need to set the standard for the rest of the world, and we need to gauge countries like China and others, hopefully collaboratively, but if not, we just need to do what's in our best interest. And we have to realize that in today's connected world, biosynthetic world, that we're going to need to be prepared for the next accident as well as natural outbreak.
It's a very important point because it could happen in the United States too. We could easily create a massive potential pandemic pathogen in a U.S. laboratory at almost any major university in the United States, let alone our own national laboratories. And if it got out, it would be our responsibility to warn about it, to help defend against it, and to basically stop it, disrupt it. So this is not just about China. This is a global problem. I must say, though, having investigated the Chinese role in the likely promulgation of COVID-19, however accidental in origin, and at least in my view, this was an accident, maybe multiple accidents, but also the cover-up. The cover-up was just absolutely systematic. And you're very correct. One of the most telling elements is that Taiwan, which is, the Republic of China across the strait, shut down its borders on January 2nd. And in fact, it was shut down well before that. As you point out, in December, they were already under a lockdown, in effect, because they had good biothreat intelligence. We obviously did not. Or when we did have intelligence, we didn't disseminate it for whatever reasons. There's so many things that could be learned from this, so we don't have it happen again. But I think one of the biggest things is why the NIH is funding research in countries that are essentially adversaries and declared adversaries of the United States. China does not hide its ambitions to usurp the United States and Asia and our allies. I mean, why we're providing money and including to programs that, as we uncovered at the State Department, were in part being funded by the People's Liberation Army. It's ridiculous if you think about it. I mean, we're providing material aid to an adversary. And whether they wanted this for bioweapons or not is a question. I guess my final question to you is, how do you define biodefense and what's legitimate in the era we live in? And we know that the Biological Weapons Convention does allow for people to create potential pandemic pathogens. But if they get out, then what should be the ramification? I mean, what you've been involved in foreign policy. What do you think the ramifications should be for China looking ahead for having covered up COVID-19? We know that for certain. Yeah, whether it created it is highly probable, but let's just say 99% maybe, it's my book, but the cover-up was much worse than the crime.
Well, I think there are two things that come to mind immediately. One is the prohibitions under the Biological Weapons Convention, which allows countries to do things that are for peaceful and prophylactic purposes. So the fact that, at least what in our investigation we found, was that the events may have been associated with a vaccine-related research is one part of the issue that says, well, that's okay. But the international health regulations, which require countries, and China is one of the signatories to that, to make notifications and makes a special mention of SARS as being one of those things that you absolutely positively should notify the world about within 48 hours, was clearly something that they did not abide by. And that is, and we can quibble over when did they know what in terms of what may have happened. One of the intriguing things we found is that maybe the initial cover-up was from local provincial authorities, but yet that would be disputed by the one fact that we had where the representative from Beijing came down, the biosecurity expert, invoking the name of Xi Jinping and mentioning of a peace sure, or implying a peace sure. So it does point out that there is a kind of an obligation by every country to abide by this. I think probably the one leg that's missing from the stool is really internationalizing the requirement for biosafety and also biosecurity around this kind of risky research, period. It clearly was a matter of concern in China. They actually passed drafted legislation prior to the pandemic in September of 2019 that outlined the requirements to do this kind of research, which to me infers, or at least implies, that there may have been some earlier event that made them aware of the dangers of this kind of research, and they were trying to either fix the problems or even may have been trying to keep the lid on what was a potentially emerging event earlier than we knew. But it does require, I think, all countries, including China, to be transparent. It does require them to be accountable as we would be accountable. And as I said, we have room for improvement, and we need to make those improvements sooner than later, because we are kind of whistling in the dark if we don't think this can't happen here in the United States.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kadlec. We really appreciated the opportunity to discuss the origins of COVID-19 and your work on biodefense over several decades here today. I hope we'll have a chance to continue the conversation in the future at a Hudson event. I want to develop a more focused review in support of the Congress's investigation, the origins, and we definitely want to tap into your incredible knowledge and experience and your your capabilities as a scholar, not just as a practitioner. But we are very grateful for your time today. Thank you.
David, thank you. And again, really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and convey this to your colleagues and to the viewership here.
Thank you.